Hello, everybody. We are back with Michael Rossi of Rutgers University to discuss the hot topic of this weekend, the Venezuela intervention, war, regime change operation, oil grab, kidnapping, whatever word you want to use. Michael, welcome back.
Pascal, New Year. What we choose to make it happy is up to us, but I'm just simply acknowledging, given everything else, New Year, Pascal, to yours and mine.
It's not a happy one. It's a very sad way to start the new year. So, Michael, New Year to you too.
Thank you very
Uh,
much. Thank you
let
very much.
uh, polemics out of the way. We still don't know what exactly went down in Venezuela at the moment as we speak in your late evening, 10, 11 p.m. in around New York at the East Coast. Thank you
Yes.
for making the time. What have you learned in the United States during this day from the Trump news conference and what came out so far?
Well, one thing that I have learned is that the narrative that the Trump regime is using is being widely disseminated among many Republicans, including many of the fragmenting MAGA offshoots, as well as much of the leadership within the Democratic Party. And we also have to acknowledge much of the leadership of Europe, including the EU, as well as many national heads of state that are applauding this. They are applauding this. They are effectively just walking in lockstep with the Trump administration, effectively saying that Maduro was a tyrant, an autocrat, a corrupt dictator, who has finally met karma and is now going to be facing justice. And we can only hope that the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan state, enjoy freedom and democracy that they have been so denied ever since it was taken away from them by Hugo Chavez. Narrative is much more appealing than empirical evidence. We have had a country like mine this is not the first time that we have engaged in effectively decapitating the leadership of a Latin American country, nor will it be the last. And let's be equally honest here. I think your viewers and my viewers will agree. This has nothing to do, little to do with democracy, and even less to do with drugs. This has everything to do with controlling a country's national resources, and hopefully putting in a compliant puppet leader in power to reinstate the relationship that Venezuela had with the United States prior to 1998, which was effectively running the country as a rentier state, largely controlled, if not completely influenced and dictated by Washington.
I just had a discussion with Ron Ledo, a former CIA analyst and a person who's worked in the security services for quite a while, and his analysis was, look, obviously it's about regime change. There's going to be plan A and plan B. Plan A will be a managed transition to basically the vice president or who else ever who has been bought off, although of course we have no proof that people have been bought off, but he said that's just what the CIA does. So optimally, this will be a smooth transition into a post-Maduro government, still with the Maduro government, and then changing heads bit by bit and changing the electoral commission and so on, and make sure that within a couple of months' time, you then get the proper puppet government in place the way we wish for it. If that doesn't work, plan B will probably be a military coup against the loyalists of Mr. Maduro. Either way, what you're saying is obviously the end goal to have somebody loyal in Venezuela and just a proper regime change. Now, since we cannot speculate too much of what went down, since we just don't have enough information, let's talk about what we know from US history. And you pointed out to me this brilliant book by Stephen Kinzer, right? Because we have a lot of academic research actually on the regime change operation, right?
I love doing this. This sort of like it. I don't know if you
Put it in the middle, please, because
yeah.
we're gonna cut
So there was a show on PBS, public broadcasting, back when I was growing up, called Reading Rainbow. It was a fantastic show. It was basically a way of getting kids to, learn how to appreciate books and whatever. This is academic Reading Rainbow. I just would like to promote to both our respective viewers Stephen Kinzer's Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq.
Yeah.
It is not an academic book in the way of it is, overly jargonistic, but it is quite informative, right? It's largely written by, journalists and such, but it repeats a pattern, very, very predictable, that we see in Venezuela. I think both of our viewers will find this book to be highly, highly informative and incredibly timely, especially when it comes to the narrative that is being generated by the Trump government, in that Venezuela was this horrible dictatorship that was engaging in all kinds of egregious human rights. And of course, the audacity to nationalize their oil industry, engage in all kinds of autocratic communist activities, and of course, thank God for Trump in the United States in restoring democracy, freedom, liberty, and whatever kinds of adjective buzzwords that Latin America needs. Yay.
Empty tropes.
Yes.
But give me the gist of the book. Like, so the the number of overthrows and the number of regime changes, also the ones that went successful and didn't, because there's still a danger that Venezuela, it might not go that way. I mean, that we might have resistance groups and guerrilla war fighting popping up in the end.
Of course. So, I will premise on this, right? It is still very early to talk about what will happen to Venezuela. You're absolutely correct. What we know right now on the ground is that Maduro and his wife have been kidnapped. They have been taken out of the country. There is no regime change in Venezuela yet. The vice president is now asserting power, is claiming that everything is stabilized and that they will resist as much as possible U.S. influence. The first option that you mention, and that is a transitional period until there is elections. This is exactly what the CIA would like to happen. This is what we would call the orderly transition. The orderly transition is to make it as clear as possible that there is no overt influence within Latin American politics. And when when we talk about this book here, we're mentioning the first attempt at regime change took place in Hawaii, which in the late 19th century, which, Hawaii ended up becoming a U.S. state. But it also includes regime changes in the Philippines, in Guatemala, in Panama, in Honduras, failed attempts in Venezuela, obviously, under Chavez, also attempts in Afghanistan, Iran under Mossadegh, and of course, Iraq. So the United States is very good at getting rid of unwanted leaders of countries. They never think about phase two, and that is who to replace it with. Ideally, they would like some kind of compliant pro-Washington puppet, which oftentimes is seen by the population of these countries as exactly that, right? A compliant puppet, somebody that takes orders from another country. This leads to instability. This leads to all kinds of socio-political unrest, which necessitates some kind of military takeover. The military usually gravitates towards some kind of political right of center, far right of center. The political right is always going to be pro-capitalist, pro-corporatist. And as long as the country is anything other than some incantation of Marxist, leftist, nationalizing, the industries, these are considered to be compliant governments. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that human rights, political rights, civil liberties are completely scuttled, in favor of whatever United Fruit Company, whatever National Standard Oil Company, takes precedent over this. This has, as I said, this has nothing to do with democracy or human rights. So to reiterate what your previous guest had said, there will, in all likelihood, be unless Trump does something, it's only Saturday. It's only Saturday. We don't know yet what's happening, but unless there is some kind of attempt at removing the other elements of the Maduro government, there will be very, very clear initiatives to change the perception of government. There might be some backhanded attempts at either putting Maria Corina Machado in power, some kind of Juan Guaido, whoever, some dime a dozen, CIA, Nobel Prize winning operative, or if the elections go the way in which the U.S. does not want, sure, absolutely. Monroe Doctrine is very popular, not just among the MAGA Republicans, but very much so among even the Democrats as well. I need to emphasize again that Trump did what he did and is getting praise from many Democratic leaders as well.
How about mainstream TV right now, like CNN and MSNBC? Like, is the general voice there now that risky but well done? What's the or is it like, oh, what an outrageous infringement on international law and breach of the UN Charter? Is no?
Mainstream media is going to run with a narrative that has been pretty much familiar since Chavez came to power, right? And that is that Venezuela has been run by a left-wing dictator who has suspended constitutional rule of law in favor of a single-party state. There will be continuous footage of emigres celebrating in the streets of some random city in Florida that are happy, right, that the government has been overthrown. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of Venezuelan politics and who is right here, but look, at the end of the day, this took place outside of electoral procedure. This took place outside of any form of international law. This took place outside of constitutional procedure. This was effectively a decapitation of a leadership while the government in Venezuela of that leadership is still in power. This is nothing more than an attempt at showing, once again, according to Trump, might makes right.
Yeah. And these finding people who celebrate the overthrow of a political leader is not difficult. Just imagine today that if Donald Trump was shot right now and who would die, you would have a good number of people who would celebrate. So for the cameras to keep focusing
across that country. Across the country,
you would have a good number. Then you would have the others who would be outraged and would call to take up the guns and shoot the people who celebrate and so on and so forth. And that's exactly, what would probably have to expect within Venezuela. Some people being very happy that Chavez is gone, and a lot other people outraged and so on. The global majority. I wonder what this will do. The Europeans, being Europeans, of course, like the problem if you're a satellite state or in a satellite existence is that, of course, it's already predetermined what you will write in your public statements, and so they do. Kaya Kallas and everybody there, like, please, the UN Charter needs to be. And it needs to be followed, and the human rights need to be respected. But Mr. Chavez, Mr. Maduro was a very bad guy. So good that he's gone. Kind of the Germany, the 6 months ago during the 12-day war, said like, oh, Israel is doing the dirty work for us. So they're gonna adapt this kind of stuff. We can also see how the U.S. is or the administration has been now already very good at crafting the narrative that this was a law enforcement operation, not military operation. It was not a military intervention. It was a law enforcement to capture a fugitive, right? So we just applied the US law with policing mechanisms. Pure nonsense, purely bogus, but it seems that this will work. But in the global majority, have you read reports from China, Brazil, from Russia, and so on, and how they are framing all of this?
Oh, of course. I mean, no surprise here. China, Brazil, Russia, the rest of BRICS are openly condemning this. I mean, this is effectively a kidnapping of a leader of a head of state without any precedent whatsoever. So, marching, in predictable footstep. The global South, the global East, the non-West, BRICS, however way that you want to call them, are obviously condemning this. And as you rightfully point out, Europe is marching in lockstep with the United States. I had a conversation a week ago with two colleagues of mine, Piotr Kurzin and James Kerlinzy. We, have regular podcasts between the three of us, and the conversation, and usually centers around Ukraine and Russia, but the conversation usually at some point focuses on the role of Europe and whether Europe is going to develop an independent voice from that of the United States. You have people like Kaja Kallas and Friedrich Merz and von der Leyen and Macron and all the other ones, every so often saying when they're not in Trump's circle that we need to break away from the United States. We need to realize that we are on our own. The transatlantic alliance that was forged after 1945 is no longer there. We need to start thinking that the U.S. is not going to always be there for us. And yet, when something like this happens, they absolutely will say, yes, we absolutely applaud this. And just in case some people doubt that we are independent, the UN Charter, the UN. I love when people reach for, legal documents as a way of showing that we're not just simply, a rogue government, but they will absolutely, absolutely support this for the very reason that Venezuela has been seen within the global Western narrative as a rogue state. So it is not surprising whatsoever to see the statements coming out from the, leaders of various countries and organizations that predictably do exactly as we think that they would. The EU is going to be cautious, but they will not say, they will not say anything like the legitimate leader has been removed. They have already acknowledged that Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. Why? Simply because they don't like him. And let's just call them the BRICS countries, are going to say, this is the reason why we need to forge closer ties, closer partnerships, even talking about the possibility, and this is, again, very much ahead of ourselves here, the idea that BRICS countries need to now consider military alliances and military agreements for collective defense as well.
That is what a friend of mine pointed out yesterday. I mean, how can BRICS countries continue doing BRICS stuff in the economic sphere if you know that when push comes to shove, the United States just sends a couple of aircraft carriers, takes out your president, kills anyone in the way, and then there goes your entire economic policy down the drains, or your plans for the future. So if BRICS doesn't step up its game and tries to reassure its members, especially China and Russia, do not try to reassure their members, their other colleagues, that we're going to do something about this. Or let me say it this way: isn't this a big blow also against BRICS?
It has the potential to be, because it's a wake-up call, right? It's a wake-up call. And it takes a country like Venezuela. Now it takes a country like Ethiopia after Italy's invasion in 1936. It takes a smaller country to take the fall for the rest to serve as a wake-up. What's interesting is that Europe, and when I say Europe, I'm largely talking about the EU leadership, they seem to be completely okay with the idea that the head of state of a sovereign country was simply removed by the United States. They will absolutely defend to the end the legitimacy of the government of Ukraine. And yet they will absolutely turn blind eye and deaf ear to what happened in Venezuela. What this effectively means is that selective diplomacy and selective liberalism will be the defining factor of 2026.
Yeah.
This is
But
how I see it.
but it also means that, the masks have been coming off for a while, but you know, and I recalled that yesterday in the conversation with my friend, the first paper ever written on how big a scam this idea of rules-based international order is, that was published either in 2021 or 2022 by John Dugard, who was also the judge in several international law courts, and now became one of the lawyers on South Africa's board that is dragging Israel to the ICJ, right? Because he's South African. And he wrote that paper only in 2021 or 2022, pointing out that the rules-based international order is not international law. The US is trying to pass it as such, but it is not. It is the opposite. It is the rule by law, not the rule of law. Although this sentence goes to Chas Freeman, Ambassador Chas Freeman. But Dugard pointed that out, and that's only 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, 4 years ago, rules-based international order still rang very strong even in our circles, right? We only learn to differentiate this from real international law recently. Isn't this just going to accelerate the falling of the masks?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it has already happened. In fact, I would, and I don't want to bring other topics into this, but the way that I see this is, I mean, Venezuela it was an easy operation. Venezuela's small potatoes as far as the West is concerned. The mask coming off of the West's concept of rules-based order has been and will be the catalyst. The primary variable is Israel. Israeli aggression against an entire group of people, the brazen,
yeah.
like just the absolute brazen admission that they are effectively eliminating an entire group of people for the sake of whatever it is that they feel will stick to their argument, and is something that is not being condemned by these very same Western countries, is going to be the one that shows us that, I mean, rules-based order is very, very, very selective. And this is, I think, what we will see moving forward in 2026. I would say that there was many, many years ago, if we're going to be talking about a couple of articles, scholarly articles written within international relations, Christopher Lane wrote extensively about the limits of unipolarism, and specifically American unipolarism in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, in which he argued that unipolar powers sow the seeds of their own demise. Largely for two reasons. Number one is that eventually, even if the unipolar power is benign and inclusive, like, when we're talking about, let's say, U.S. global capitalism, U.S. global soft power, inclusiveness, right? Eventually new powers are going to rise, not out of competition, but just simply because this is just, what happens is that countries' economies grow, certain countries become, more independently assertive, or unipolar powers can collapse faster when the unipolar power perceives these rising countries as threats. The United States vacillates between both, and it has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican, but whenever a country decides to assert its sovereign autonomy, there is a knee-jerk reaction within the State Department and the Defense Department. Doesn't matter who runs the country, but this is seen as a potential challenge to American in general, and Western, in technical superiority. And so countries like Russia or China or Iran or Venezuela, for that matter, are going to be seen as non-cooperative players. So as far as the foreign policy strategy is concerned, any leader of any country that effectively says, like, Maria Machado is, put me in power and I will absolutely make my country compliant and cooperative with the United States again. We will open up the economy to oil or gas or, whatever it happens to be, right?
And I will relocate the embassy of Venezuela to Jerusalem. I mean, the cherry on top.
Icing on the cake. Icing on the cake. Cherry on top. Pick your, pick your allegory here. Yeah, yes, absolutely, right? They're becoming they're becoming more just transparent. I mean, I don't know. I kind of long for the days of Cold War puppets who were a bit more strategic in their narrative. Today, they just don't really seem to care. Like I said, this has nothing to do with democracy. This has nothing to do with human rights. This has even less to do with drugs, for God's sake. I mean, if we're going to talk about drugs, I mean, the federal government does not tolerate any challenge to its own monopoly on the drug trade. But Venezuela was an easy country to pick off. And, right, and I'll finish off with this, is that the narrative within the media is going to go back to well-established stories of Venezuela being a dictatorship, being anti-American, being anti-Western, being pro-Russian. Maduro also being a sidekick of Hugo Chavez, whom, has been dead for many, many years. But I remember distinctively, right, American media played Chavez up as kind of like a dollar store Castro who needs to be replaced. And finally, right, and this goes again to Kinzer's book, Overthrow, is that the Monroe Doctrine has never left the desk of any sitting president, any Latin American leader. And it doesn't matter whether they are paragons of democracy or the stereotypical tin pot dictator. Any Latin American head of state that has the audacity to not just simply follow the directives of Washington is going to be in the crosshairs of the CIA. And Maduro is just the latest example of this.
Yeah, but isn't it? I mean, it's quite fascinating. There must have been, like, the Kinzer. How many does he count these overthrows? And if you just focus on Latin America alone, it must be dozens.
Yes, I mean,
dozens of attempted or actually successfully implemented regime changes. Yet they have to do it time and again. And Monroe Doctrine is now nearly 200 years old, and they have to again and again and again overthrow governments. Okay, when it comes to Hawaii, it was very successful, but it was also implemented through settler colonialism and then the replacement of the locals through white settlers and incorporation, and ultimately becoming an integral part of the United States, the end state of settler colonialism, right? But that's obviously something that cannot happen in South America. You cannot make Venezuela the 51st state. Yet this approach seems to render success for a certain period of time until it doesn't. So it keeps coming back, right? It's like the nail, and you whack the mole, and then the US keeps whacking the mole. Question is, how long can it whack the mole successfully? It seems, at least from the way the operation went down within one goddamn night, that they're still pretty good at it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the United States is very good when we want to. We are very, very good at decapitating leadership, but we never really care about the long-term consequences. That's not the point. Okay, that's not the point. You have to also think about who in U.S. media and who within social media are applauding this. Many of whom are MAGA members that have started to go astray here or there with Trump regarding, some of his other decisions, the Epstein files, Israel, being, when we talk about America first, it's ultimately Israel first and then America. I mean, this is sort of an open rift within MAGA. We could see this as a very simple tactic of wagging the dog, and rallying around the flag of American patriotism and the idea that America, when we want to, can achieve in 24 hours what Russia can't achieve in 4 years. And the response, the predictable response, is very much focusing on the immediate success of getting rid of an incredibly unpopular leader. And the narratives that are now coming in are, well, we're not focusing on the idea that that the government is still in power, right, in Venezuela. We are now just simply talking about the idea that now that Maduro is out of power, oil is going to once again be, returned to the United States. Trump has been talking about this idea of Venezuela stole American oil, which, if you pause to think about this for more than 5 seconds, makes absolutely no sense. But Trump doesn't focus on anything for more than 3 seconds before he goes and talks about something else. This whole idea of stolen oil plays into it's an outdated and incredibly obscure narrative that anyone who has been part of the State Department, advocating the Monroe Doctrine, will tell you that prior to Chavez coming to power in 1998, and this is something that most people don't know, Venezuela was regarded as one of the most democratic states in all of Latin America. Okay. And we have to take this with a certain grain of salt here. All right. Please don't think that we're talking about a paragon of political rights and civil liberties. But Venezuelan democracy was largely run by two political parties, right? Two political parties. The first one was known as Acción Democrática, AD. The second political party was Comité de Organización Política Electoral Independiente, which we'll just simply call COPE instead, AD and COPE. These were two parties that, one got elected out, the other one got elected in. The thing is that both of these parties ran the country for roughly 40 years. Let's just say 40, 45 years. Okay. And, they're your typical right of center, left of center, but very much pro-corporatist, pro-American investment, pro-business. They represented the upper echelons of Venezuelan society, to which I would say amounted to, at best, 30 to 35% of the population. Right? The remaining population was off the electoral grid. Outside the major cities, within the countryside, we never really cared about them. Okay. And both of these parties were very much pro-neoliberal, very much anti-Marxist, anti-left, anti-communist. I wouldn't say that they were anti-authoritarian, because they certainly practiced tactics of political monopolization. But as long as you're in the good graces of the United States, it's amazing what you can get away with. It's amazing. Take a look at Bolsonaro versus Lula da Silva. And without the benefit of social media or independent journalism, the average American who knows little to nothing about any of these countries is just simply going to take what the New York Times, the Washington Post, or CBS says, for granted. So Trump's whole narrative of our, American oil was stolen plays into very much something that the United States does not tolerate at all. And that is somebody who is not vetted by the West comes to power and does the worst thing possible: nationalizes the energy sector. Mossadegh did this in Iran. Chavez did this in Venezuela. Castro did this in Cuba. How dare you take our resources that we worked so hard through some corporate shell company for the last 40, 50 years to monopolize? And so when something like this happens, we either will pay the opposition to run an election, which if they win, fantastic, And if they don't, we'll consider other tactics. I mean, this is and Venezuela just falls into this right now. And look, I need to also emphasize that, the leadership of Maduro aside, I'm not saying that this is some Nelson Mandela, that this is some Thomas Sankara. I mean, Venezuelan politics is problematic. Let's be very, very honest, is that, political rights and civil liberties have been hamstrung since Chavez's reelection in 2002, right? There is ample evidence that this has taken place. But how many countries have the United States openly worked with that absolutely stifles political rights and civil liberties? We don't care about that as the energy sector is open and available to us.
I just need to emphasize that Saudi Arabia still beheads people on public squares.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem. That's just not a problem. Saudi Arabia has, under the last Trump presidency, literally chopped up, while still alive, a journalist in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. And that is forgiven and forgotten. It's long gone. Everything's fine. As long as you play along, more or less, within the oil sector, although Saudi Arabia is like treading very thin ice there as well. But yeah, so human rights are obviously a smokescreen, right? But the question to me then is like why is it such a huge problem? Why is it not possible to just have an integrated economy? Why do you need to run it? Why not just like work with it? Venezuela was willing to work on all kinds of levels with the United States. We know that, but it's not enough. Radhika Desai, our colleague, she would say like it's the inevitable logic of capitalism, which always needs to grow out and grow larger. And at some point, you can only do it through absolutely disproportional extraction, right? So it's the logic of the US system, of US capitalism, that drives colonialism. And what we are seeing now is not just neocolonialism, it's outright blatant like 19th century type of colonialism of like, we go in, we take the bastard out, and then we will tell you what's going to happen next. So Viceroy, go in.
Yeah, a good friend and colleague of mine opined the same thing, is that if we were to describe Trump's policy, beyond America first, sort of euphemistically what we would call neoliberalism in one state, right? Neoliberalism in one state. There's this idea of, America first. We're not going to rely on any other country for, imports, for this, that, and the other. But the law of capitalism, and this is why Marxism never falls out of fashion, is that the need for raw materials from developing countries feeds the capitalist empire. And Venezuela is one of the largest oil-producing countries in the world. And, if Maduro or Chavez would just simply chop up the right journalists, everything would be fine. That's the whole point. Saudi Arabia stifles the right dissent as far as the West is concerned. Right? That's the point. This has nothing to do with democracy at all. And I think both of our viewers understand this. This had nothing to do with democracy whatsoever. But it has a lot to do also with the idea that, and this is not the most scholarly way of explaining this, but it gets the point across. If my country was to ever be diagnosed with a behavioral disorder, it would be malignant narcissistic personality disorder. The United States is a collapsing narcissist. There's no question about that. We love countries that feed our ego, and we cannot suffer countries that wound it, which is the reason why my country is one of the few, if only, major countries in the world that wages their foreign policy on a very simple axiom. We don't like you, so we're not going to work with you. We don't like you, Iran. We don't like you, Russia. We don't like you, Venezuela. We hate you, Cuba. Why? Because you point out what, policy can be outside of being part of the, American pyramid. And we will do everything in our power to remove that leadership. So if the removal of Maduro in Venezuela produces the right results, do not doubt that the Trump administration, and you have to remember who the Secretary of State is, Marco Rubio, his crusading policies to liberate Cuba. It is just absolutely amazing how much hatred American foreign policy has for a country like Cuba. Again, not because it's communist, not because it's dictatorial, but just simply because it has avoided American influence since 1959.
Or Haiti, for that matter.
Or
We care to be a slave colony that manages to get away, then for 200 years, probably another 200 from now, you're gonna be punished for
we
trying to get away.
We can and should have a conversation about Haiti, because this is a country that you're absolutely correct. It was the first and most successful slave rebellion in modern history. And how dare you? How dare you, effectively? That's not to say that, look, that is not to say, and I think, there's going to be always criticism from the other side saying that you're turning blind eye and deaf ear to corruption and human rights abuses and other elements within these countries. They exist. They absolutely exist. There is no question about that. But please, please, please do not think that Venezuela or Haiti or Cuba or whatever is going to become, Luxembourg after a overthrow. It doesn't happen. It does not happen. In fact, what ends up happening is that the problems mitigate. And interestingly enough, those from these countries that are fleeing internal turmoil and autocratic governments that terrorize their own population run to the United States. And then the very same governments that overthrow these countries are wondering, why are these people from these countries coming to our countries illegally? We need to build a wall and kick them out.
Yeah, but the sad thing is that overthrows have a pretty decent track record of working. And I'm not saying working for the countries that got overthrown, not at all, but that's not the point. Those who do the overthrow don't think about the countries they overthrow. They think about the United States. And if you look at it, Iraq is often portrayed as a huge blunder and failure, right? I mean, we know weapons of mass destruction were a lie. We know that it went down very poorly. We know that it created ISIS and other kind of terrorist organizations. But for 20 years, Iraqi oil has been under U.S. control. So has Northern Syrian oil. The U.S. the U.S. capitalists. This was highly successful. I mean, in the countries, millions of people are living in most precarious situations, but for the capitalists, very successful. Libya was a pain in the West's ass, right? And that one is taken out. It now has open air slave markets and whatnot, and it's a failed state. But problem solved. The other overthrows, I mean, again, like Hawaii today, it became literally the 50th state of the US after Alaska. It's very successful. Like there's a history of these things going pretty well. Ukraine, overthrow of Yanukovych, very successful in order then to install a regime and to wage this proxy war without even a single drop of US blood against a major enemy in the East. So overall, these overthrows, unfortunately, they work pretty well, and every once in a while one goes wrong and produces kind of a negative backlash, like in Iran, where the overthrow of the Shah was then the proximate reason for 20 years later and even more anti-American regime coming to power. But if 1 out of 4 goes wrong, then that's still a pretty good wager to make, right?
Well, if you're an economist, who cares about democracy? Who cares about human rights? Who cares about slavery?
Precisely. So the sad thing is it works. That's why they do it, right?
It works in the immediate future. But you mentioned also something else, and that is it works for 20 years until there's a backlash. right? It works until there is a revolution, which, okay, I mean, if the revolution does unseat the pro-Washington, the pro-Western regime, we have one of two options. One, we re-overthrow it, or two, we just simply isolate it. We demonize it. We make it the reason why there is instability in that region, right? And if we cannot overthrow that government, we will start funding, financing, and aiding other countries that are, if at best, as egregious as they are, if not even worse, but they take our money. Hence the reason why all of a sudden Saddam Hussein became a chief ally and partner of the United States in the 1980s. Hence the reason why we can and will continue to write blank check after blank check to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to whatever. Simply playing on the idea that we are outsourcing our defense to neighboring countries that equally hate the guts of this other country. We can and will, and when we talk about Latin America, I find Latin America to be something that we don't spend a lot of time on, because when there are elections in Latin America, it now increasingly goes to either one of two types of candidates. The first candidate is a full-on committed Marxist who wants to disengage from the Monroe Doctrine, who wants to join an alliance of growing countries from the developing world. And the other one is an unapologetic neo-Nazi. With names like Mengele Eichmann within their background or whatever it is. I mean, it's just like, we have this election in Chile where, a Pinochetist was elected. The United States has absolutely no problem with that. Bolsonaro, when he was in charge of Brazil, is somebody who would, if he could, he would have turned the entire Amazon rainforest into a golf course for the very economists and technocrats that see absolutely no problem with this, because they're going to enjoy the next 15 to 20 years living the good life. And by the time the ecosystem goes to shit, they'll be dead. And so at that point, you have to remember, the far right is much more agreeable to American capitalism. The left has the audacity of wanting to control the economy for their own people. And hence, that's the reason why we all of a sudden start talking about more left-wing leaders as dictators, as autocrats, as human rights violators. I mean, these things happen on the right as well, but they happen on the right, but they also take place amid neoliberalism.
Yeah. No, it's quite simple. The people on the left who would like the national wealth to be distributed to their own people, we call those people communists, socialists, and scum, right? And the people on the right who would like to use the national resources for national causes, we call those populists. So we get rid of them. The only good Democrats are the people who agree that it is very important that we soon have the first trillionaire and then even more of the trillionaires, and who then show up right behind the President of the United States during inauguration, just in order to drive home the point of how the system actually runs.
Yep.
New
Year. New Year
to you too, Michael. New Year. New Year, old tragedies. Michael Rossi, people who want to find you, there's your YouTube channel, of course. You have your own, and we will produce this video here in collaboration, I hope. So I will add your name as a co-collaborator. People can find you on YouTube. They can find you somewhere else, X, I think.
I do have an X pro. You know what? Here's my thing: is that I go on X, Twitter, for more than 3 minutes, and I realize why I've been off of it for so many months.
Yeah, I hate it too. Yeah, I do. But
so best way right now is the YouTube. I plan on making some significant changes to my channel in this coming year. I've been, unfortunately, not as attentive to it as I was. As you know, I was teaching so many courses at so many universities over the fall. There just was not a lot of time for me to do this. But we have some potential good, fruitful projects on the immediate horizon. And I hope to, make this more of a recurring collaboration project with you and among others within our cohort of like-minded scholars.
I hope we can do that. We'll work toward it. And again, everybody, New Year.
New Year. New Year.